From National 9 News, this is Nightline with Hugh Riminton.
Australia off to war as the PM commits more forces to fight in Afghanistan. New bombing raids, but the US hits the wrong targets. And the budget surplus shrinks by more than $1 billion. Good evening. Australian forces could be fighting in Afghanistan within weeks. The Prime Minister today committed to increase our role in the war against terrorism. Mr Howard says more than 1,500 Australian defence personnel will now be sent to the region to join up with US-led forces. His decision follows a personal request from US President Bush.
Last night, President Bush telephoned me.
The offer of help made immediately after the September 11 outrages has been called in. We are going to war, in numbers far larger than ever previously suggested.
Our forces will be overseas fighting in our name within a very short period of time. They will go with our best wishes, our prayers for a safe return.
1,550 Australian soldiers, sailors and Air Force personnel will go, the deployment comprising one 150-strong detachment of elite Special Air Service troops, 2 P-3 Orion long-range reconnaissance and patrol aircraft, 2 Boeing 707 tankers for air-to-air refuelling, 4 Hornet FA-18 fighter aircraft, an amphibious command ship with helicopter capacity and 3 guided missile frigates.
All these activities, operations and the involvement of our personnel have the full support of the opposition.
The Prime Minister, in caretaker mode, rang Mr Beazley to brief him after speaking with President Bush.
This is a bipartisan commitment to a most important operation.
The Australian contingent will have an Australian commander but be under American control. In fact, the first hint of Australia's higher involvement came from Washington.
The President this morning spoke with Australian Prime Minister Howard.
The commitment is open-ended. The first troops could be in action within a week or two. The bulk of the forces will be in place within a month. The SAS soldiers can be expected to take frontline duties, including searching for Osama bin Laden and fighting hand-to-hand, if need be, the troops of the Taliban.
I can't pretend for a moment that there won't be casualties.
Some observers say casualties will be inevitable. A retired Pakistani general who formerly headed Pakistan's intelligence network says Australia is acting irrationally and impulsively in joining this war in tough terrain against an experienced fighting enemy.
From a purely professional point of view, I would say that it's going to be a great disaster.
But the Prime Minister says after September 11, the terrorist threat to Australia is as great as that to the United States. Whatever the risks, he says, this is our war.
We have to do it. I mean, our way of life is under attack.
Australia's deployment to the war is likely to cost, according to one defence analyst, more than $5 million a day. Many of the operational details are being kept secret to protect our military personnel, although our elite Special Forces troops are likely to be the first to see action.
Sydney's Garden Island, headquarters of the Navy's Maritime Strike Force, and today the centre of the bulk of our preparations to go to war. The guided missile frigate Sydney back in port for a few hours to refuel and take on stores and additional crew before sailing for Darwin and the Middle East. By mid-afternoon, the Sydney was on her way. Later, she'll be joined by 2 other frigates and either of the combat transporters, Canimbla, or its twin, the Manura. One will sail soon to act as control centre for the Australian forces. Almost certainly the next to go, probably within a few days, Special Air Service troopers from their base near Perth. They'll fly to one of the US airfields now encircling Afghanistan on RAAF Hercules transports via the British-American base on the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia.
To capture or kill bin Laden, you've first got to find him. Australian SAS troops are very good at this type of operation.
Their first priority, acclimatising to the savage winter conditions they'll encounter in Afghanistan.
SAS will face very severe conditions, but provided they've got the right equipment, then they will handle it, because these are very, very tough soldiers with a lot of physical and mental endurance.
The Air Force will have 2 707 airborne tankers and 4 F-18 fighters on the way soon.
They are there to provide a measure of air defence, particularly to the Australian naval flotilla.
The Air Force's P-3C Orions will carry state-of-the-art communications interception gear. Their job, eavesdropping on the Taliban. The young men and women on board the Sydney won't be allowed to sail into harm's way without a proper send-off. Both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader will travel to Darwin soon to wish the ship and its crew farewell and safe return. Other farewells, especially for the SAS troopers, will probably not be held in public. They like it best when no one knows they're coming. Peter Harvey for Nightline.
Taking our continued commitment to East Timor into account, we will soon have, by some counts, more Australian personnel deployed in anger overseas since World War II. In charge of them, at least until his retirement at the federal election in 3.5 weeks, is Defence Minister Peter Reith, and he joins us now. Mr Reith, thanks for your time. What are our objectives in this? When will we know that we have done the job?
Our objectives are to make a meaningful contribution to the efforts of the coalition to root out bin Laden and those who support him and those who harbour him.
So at what point does our contribution become enough and we can come home?
Clearly, how the circumstances are going to pan out is something in the future, and we don't have a crystal ball. We do, however, in the arrangements that we are putting in place, have an Australian command element so that the Australian government continues to maintain control over the operation and deployment of Australian troops.
So is it your suggestion then that if this gets too difficult, if it gets too hard, if it seems to be going on for too long, that we will still have the ability to say, well, we have made our contribution, now we're out of it, America, it's up to you? Well,
the Australian government always retains that right, obviously, but I mean, we are a very close ally with the United States. And obviously, you know, all these matters are going to be discussed as we go along. I think it's too early to be talking about the exit strategy, Hugh. There's a lot of work to be done in the meantime.
Well, give us your most sober assessment then of the dangers facing our personnel there, particularly those SAS troops who will be deployed in the field in Afghanistan.
We expect our people to be on the ground. We expect them to be in very hazardous circumstances. You can't understate the seriousness and the hazards which they are likely to face. They are not going to be sitting on the fence. We expect that they will be very much involved in the coalition operations. Now, some sources we're talking to in Pakistan say Australians simply have no idea of what they're getting themselves into with winter coming on against an enemy that's war-hardened and intimately familiar with the terrain there. Do you sign up to that view? No, I don't. I am reassured by the advice of the Chief of the Defence Force that our people are very well trained. They are certainly well equipped. They do have a good understanding of that which they are about to face. Now, judging by the polls, there is strong support and has been strong support for Australia's commitment to the American partnership in this matter. How resilient do you think that will be if, and as we all hope it doesn't happen, Australian troops start coming home in body bags? Well, again, I don't want to sort of attempt to foretell the future here, but there is very strong political support across the political divides. Australians do appreciate that not only did Australians die in New York, but furthermore, the fundamental values which underpin the sort of society that we are at risk if we are not prepared to respond and stand up to terrorists and their activities. OK, Peter Reith, Defence Minister, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Thank you. The United States has again been embarrassed by a false shot in this war. The Pentagon has admitted its bombs hit 2 Red Cross warehouses. They thought they were targeting Taliban military supply stores. Bombing raids continue, though, with reports that a major fuel depot has been hit. The US continues to claim evidence that the Taliban is weakening, with the group's foreign minister apparently making new diplomatic approaches to the West.
As explosions continue to light up the Kabul skyline for the 10th night running, there are more rumours that the unity of the Taliban is starting to crumble. One news agency reports the Taliban foreign minister, seen here welcoming back a plane load of Afghan hostages, has left Afghanistan and has contacted a representative of the ex-Afghan king, Zahir Shah, in Rome. But that's been firmly denied by the king's spokesman in Rome. Meanwhile, new pictures have appeared on Al Jazeera TV of what appear to be unexploded bombs near the Red Cross depot in Kabul, which was bombed yesterday. The Pentagon now admits that one of its 450-pound bombs hit the warehouses, but says it thought the Taliban were using them to store military supplies. The Red Cross says the building was only used to stockpile humanitarian aid.
It was a store basically containing non-food items such as blankets, tarpaulins, jerry cans, these kind of things.
In India, US Secretary of State Colin Powell is continuing his efforts to shore up the international coalition against terrorism. There was hilarity when one reporter accidentally elevated the Indian foreign minister to prime minister.
I'm so sorry. We got you in trouble.
But the message from Colin Powell about Afghanistan was all too serious.
I want to make it clear that our focus in Afghanistan now is eradicating the al-Qaeda network, to end the terrorist use of Afghanistan as a safe haven, to stop the invasion of Afghanistan that has taken place as a result of the presence of al-Qaeda.
Meanwhile, in Britain, Foreign Secretary Jack Straw is leaving for Brussels and then Turkey to discuss Afghanistan.
And I shall be talking to the Turkish leaders, particularly Prime Minister Ecevit and Foreign Minister Cem, about their advice as a country between a key strategic location between Europe and Asia, a secular country but with 98% of its population Muslim, about their views about the future of Afghanistan.
In Kabul, there are reports of more explosions to the south of the city, but it's reported the anti-aircraft guns of the Taliban were silent last night. But fierce fighting is continuing in the north, where the Northern Alliance, which opposes the Taliban, is said to be close to capturing the strategically important town of Mazar-e-Sharif. If it does, it could radically alter the balance of power in northern Afghanistan. And within the last hour, more explosions and fires have been caught on film in Kabul, sending more thick clouds of smoke once again billowing over this ruined city.
And more disturbing information has come through today about the anthrax alert in the United States. It turns out the infected letter sent to American Senate leader Tom Daschle contained a strain of anthrax so pure it could only have been made in a specialist state-run laboratory. The suspicion now falls even more onto a handful of nations.
The FBI released a photocopy today of the envelope it arrived in. The postmark, Trenton, New Jersey, October 8th. The return address was to a school that does not exist. And the letter it contained said, 9/11/01, this is next, take your medicine, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. But it was the purity of that anthrax that for investigators is both a worry and a clue.
This is the kind of anthrax that experts call weaponized. And what that really means is it's small enough to be inhaled, which is the more deadly form of anthrax. Those small particles, between 1 and 5 microns that can go into the lungs, have a tendency to clump together. So various countries have come up with ways to create anti-clumping material that keeps them apart, keeps them in the air. The places that have done that include Russia, Iraq, Britain, and the United States. It takes a lot of money and special machinery to do it.
This is how it looked around the Capitol building today, practically empty outside, which is definitely not normal. Inside one of the Senate office buildings, not normal either. They shut down the offices of 12 senators so that hazmat teams could sweep for anthrax. Then a line formed for people to be tested for anthrax. Ultimately, hundreds of people were waiting their turn. Staff, service people, and U.S. senators.
There is at least the remote chance that spores could have gone through the ventilation system.
Side by side with the Daschle envelope, authorities released a copy of the envelope that was mailed to NBC News and that also tested positive for anthrax. They believe they see a similarity in the handwriting. The NBC letter also bore a Trenton, New Jersey postmark, but it was mailed 22 days earlier than the Daschle letter.
Let's cross now to Pakistan to get a view from that country, which is so crucial to this war effort. In Islamabad, Pakistani political analyst Mamoon Tariq Khan. Mr. Khan, thanks for joining us. Australian troops are on their way there to go to war. What conditions will they find?
Well, everyone needs to understand that whenever an army fights another army, it is the better equipped army, the better trained army that wins. Whenever an army fights a nation, it is always the nation that wins. You look at it with the Americans in Vietnam, you look at it with the Russians in Afghanistan. There is an entire generation of Americans who still has nightmares about the war in Vietnam, and a similar generation in Russia when they went into Afghanistan. This war is going to be no different. In fact, it's going to be worse because there are TV channels like CNN and BBC and Channel 9 News over here that'll show us the horrors which they never saw in those over there. There are pictures that I've seen of the Russians in Afghanistan where the Russian soldiers hanging from trees with their private parts stuck in their mouth. It's a horrific scene that awaits anyone who goes into Afghanistan. It's something that the Australian people really need to understand, especially when they keep this in mind that this is a hunt for a suspect. Whatever happened to innocent until proven guilty.
Isn't that the point, though, Mr. Sorry to interrupt you there. Isn't that the point, though, in that both Washington, President Bush, and also Prime Minister Howard here in Australia have stressed the point that this is not a war against Afghanistan, but rather a war against terror, and specifically Osama bin Laden and those people in the Taliban who support him. Isn't that a sufficiently limited aim to make this a possible action? You seem to indicate as if it's almost an impossible battle to win.
It is an impossible battle to win, but let me explain this war against terror. It is not really a war against terror. See, it is very clear that the people that are going to be killed in Afghanistan, the Taliban or the people supporting the Taliban or the Iranian people, were not directly responsible for the terrorist attacks in the World Trade Center bombings or any other in the world. But it'll be clear that those people that are going to die from this point onwards, and those hundreds that have died so far, were directly responsible. The responsibility lies with the American people right now, and maybe the Australian to come. I think my message to the Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, and to the opposition leader, Beazley, is that they should not use this as an item for their next November 10th elections. I think there's this great fascination of using war as a great advantage to getting hopes high for the next elections.
Okay, well, it's fairly bipartisan. It's not so much an election issue here, I can tell you, but the Prime Minister has warned the nation here of the very real possibility of casualties for those Australian troops. You plainly agree that those dangers of casualties exist?
Of course I do. And one other reason is because when the Russians went in, they had the supply line from their own country. You'll have to realize that the supply line is going to be through Pakistan. And there was a poll yesterday that 87% of Pakistanis supported the Taliban. Now that means that maybe ground troops going into Afghanistan, that may actually be the straw that breaks the government's back over here. There may be mobs that take over all your supply depots over here, and you're sandwiched between the Pakistanis here and the Afghanis in Afghanistan.
Okay, Mr. Khan, we hear reports, chiefly, it must be admitted, coming from the United States, that the Taliban is crumbling, and we've heard from President Musharraf that the war would be over in a day if the Taliban's leader was to be killed. What is your assessment of the weakness or otherwise of the Taliban now as a guerrilla force?
Well, the Taliban crumbling is immaterial because the guerrilla force is the entire nation of Afghanistan. Them crumbling is not a significant point. The point is that who's going to come and replace them over there? Until you have someone who has control over the Afghan nation that'll tell them what to do and what not to do, there is no way that you can ever expect the guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan to end just because the Taliban come down.
Okay, Mamoon Tariq Khan in Islamabad, thank you for joining us. In the Middle East, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine has claimed responsibility for the assassination of a right-wing Israeli politician. The tourism minister, Rahavan Zeevi, was shot dead in a Jerusalem hotel. The Palestinian group says the shooting was revenge for the killing of its leader by Israeli forces 2 months ago. Zeevi was among 7 MPs who pulled out of Israel's coalition government earlier this week. Now back home to the federal election campaign, which shifted today into a debate over fiscal management, with the Treasurer releasing his economic review. He revealed the budget surplus will be down by more than $1 billion, but says a coalition government, if returned, would not be forced to impose additional taxes.
Overall, it wasn't a bad result, despite the expected drop in the budget surplus. Buffeted by a sharp decline in the global economy, the surplus this year is now expected to come in at just $500 million, $1 billion less than originally forecast.
Counteracting the serious world economic downturn has been a strengthening of domestic demand in the Australian economy.
Low interest rates and a booming housing market have helped insulate the economy, which is still expected to grow by 3% this year, despite weaker exports and a slump in business investment. As for the cost of Australia's military commitment to the war on terrorism, the Treasurer says that's already been accounted for and won't require any new taxes to keep the budget in the black.
In terms of funding, the fighter force, the surveillance force, the ships and the troops, that's all factored into the budget.
Even so, that still leaves both sides with very little leeway to fund their election promises. Labor says it was always expecting that would be the case.
And why? Because the Treasurer 12 months ago boasted that he was going to spend the surplus so Labor couldn't.
Nonetheless, Mr Crean is adamant that despite the cost, the opposition will still make good on its promise to roll back the GST.
We are still committed to do it because ordinary Australian families need taxation relief. The GST has hurt them and hurt them hard.
Laurie Wilson reporting for Nightline.
And tomorrow on Nightline we begin a series of special reports on the federal election, looking at the seats where the election will be won or lost. Here is a quick preview.
6 months ago we were in deep trouble.
As the man who's defending the most marginal Liberal seat in Australia, Liberal MP Ross Cameron was heading for the political scrap heap. But now there's an air of confidence in his campaign, and Labor's David Borger knows the war in Afghanistan means he faces a tough battle.
I've got an old pair of boots, the holes are starting to form in the soles now, and I intend to wear them out between now and election day.
Brad Schmidt will have that full report tomorrow on Nightline. Now, after the break, a man charged over the Rockhampton murders of 2 children, freedom for a man who killed a burglar, and a record $30 million drug haul. This is Nightline. A man has been charged over the murders of a young brother and sister in Rockhampton in Queensland. He appeared before a magistrate today after being arrested more than 300 kilometres from the murder scene.
It was a long night for police and forensic experts after the discovery of the children's bodies in bushland on the northern outskirts of Rockhampton. School friends and teachers are in shock.
We have counsellors working with specific classes today, as you could appreciate. And yes, my feeling is the staff are coping quite well.
13-year-old Russell Griffin and his 9-year-old sister Kimberly left their home on Monday afternoon to go into the bush with a family acquaintance to look for wood to make didgeridoos. Police were anxious to speak with 33-year-old Joseph Button. Last night he was picked up on the Burnett Highway near Goomeri, west of Gympie. Once police from Rockhampton arrived, he was questioned for hours and examined by a doctor. This afternoon, Button was charged with 2 counts of murder and a string of other unrelated offences before a magistrate in Mergen. He was remanded to appear in a court in Rockhampton. Sally Eels for Nightline.
In Adelaide, police have freed a man who stabbed an intruder to death during a violent home invasion. Up to 6 people armed with knives and iron bars smashed their way into the home overnight. They bashed the 27-year-old occupant and demanded cannabis and cash. The man fought back with a samurai sword, killing one of the intruders and slashing several others. The Director of Public Prosecutions will decide whether charges should be laid over the killing. In Sydney, the National Crime Authority has seized more than $30 million worth of ecstasy, the second largest haul of the drug in Australian history. 430,000 tablets were hidden inside a shipment of marble tiles brought in from Malaysia.
It's been an intensive investigation both here in Australia and in Hong Kong and Malaysia.
6 people have faced court. A trial has begun in Sydney over the death of Leo Nguyen, a baby who died from heat exhaustion after the car he was in was allegedly stolen last December. The man charged over the death today admitted getting into the car. He denies stealing it.
Leo Nguyen's mother broke down in court today as she recalled the circumstances of her son's death. In December last year, she left him sleeping in her BMW with the engine on to power the air conditioning as she collected takeaway food from a nearby shop at Cabramatta. The Crown alleges that during the second, she had her back turned. The car was driven off by 28-year-old Leslie William Cooper, arrested in Canberra 2 weeks later. It's alleged Cooper dumped the vehicle in a street 900 metres away near Cabramatta High School after realising Leo was strapped into the back seat. The court heard Leo was found 2.5 hours later, unable to be revived after suffering multiple organ failure from heat exhaustion. Cooper has been accused of criminal negligence by abandoning the car and his duty of care. The jury was told Cooper will admit his fingerprints and DNA were found inside the BMW, but his defence said he only entered the car when it was parked near the school and denied he was responsible for stealing it from the Cabramatta shopping centre. The court was told Cooper went to the street in search of drugs, saw the car parked with keys in the ignition, but fled after seeing Leo in the back. The trial is expected to last 2 weeks. Adam Walters reporting for Nightline.
3 men who bashed West Indian cricketer Marlon Black have been sentenced to 3 years jail by a Victorian court. The pace bowler was left unconscious on a Melbourne city street last February after being chased down and attacked after a nightclub scuffle.
Something that I would like to really reflect on again, the way it happened, and, like I said, I'm just happy that justice is served.
The judge described the assault as cowardly and vindictive. The men will spend a year behind bars before being eligible for parole. Also in Melbourne, a contractor is in a serious but stable condition after being impaled on a shovel. The 52-year-old slipped while climbing down a ladder, the shovel handle penetrating 40 centimetres into his body, but amazingly missing all major organs.
He's had a substantially damaging injury, okay, insofar as it could be life-threatening in most occasions, but this guy's come out quite lucky, actually.
It was a delicate rescue operation. WorkSafe is investigating. In New South Wales, more than 24,000 nurses will walk off the job tomorrow to demand action over staff shortages. The stop work will affect 142 hospitals and health centres, with the state's most senior doctors backing the nurses' cause.
It's not just nurses that are sending out this message. We, as their colleagues, are saying to both the public and to politicians, this is a real crisis and it needs to be addressed urgently.
The nurses also want a 15% pay rise. Staff will be on hand for emergencies. In a moment, all the sports news, including a surprise scratching from the Spring Carnival, a coach finally confirmed for the Eagles, and centuries galore at the cricket. To sport now, and Melbourne's Spring Racing Carnival has been robbed of a star attraction with the shock news that Lonhro has gone amiss and is out of the Cox Plate. The son of Octagonal brilliantly won last Saturday's Caulfield Guineas and was considered a genuine lightweight chance in the Weight for Age Classic. Lonhro will now be spelled. In the Pura Cup, Tasmanian openers Jamie Cox and Dean Hills have made centuries on day one of their game against New South Wales. At stumps, Tasmania was 4 for 328 with captain Ricky Ponting on 75. Paceman Stuart Clark taking all the wickets. At the Adelaide Oval, Victoria is 4 for 228 after the opening day of their match against South Australia. Brad Hodge is not out 100. Paul Rofe, the best of the bowlers.
Rain delayed the start of play by half an hour, but despite the conditions, the Adelaide Oval wicket was at its familiar best. Victorian openers Jason Arnberger and Matthew Elliott finding the boundary with worrying regularity. After a second delay, the Redbacks needed a breakthrough. Rookie paceman Paul Rofe delivering just that right on lunch. He repeated the dose straight after the interval. Matthew Mott gone for 2. When skipper Lehman pounced to run out the dangerous Elliott, his decision to send the Vicks in looked a good one. But Brad Hodge and Michael Klinger steadied for the visitors, adding 83 for the 4th wicket. In Sydney, Tasmania are 4 for 328 after centuries from openers Dean Hills and Jamie Cox. The Blues' woes were compounded when Mark Waugh split the webbing in his right hand after dropping Hills with the score at just 24.
A second slip has put it down.
Waugh is expected to bat. And he wasn't the only one in the wars. Later in the day, Tasmanian Scott Kremeskothen was forced to retire hurt after being struck a sickening blow by Blues paceman Stuart Clark. Ross Stargett for Nightline.
After all the fuss, only one Australian Rugby League player now says he won't go on the shortened Kangaroo Tour of England. Shane Webke wouldn't talk about his decision today, but he has made his feelings clear in the past.
Represent your country, which isn't the case. We just don't want to represent a country under such, stressful times.
Captain Brad Fittler is also keeping his head down after changing his mind and deciding to tour. The coach adamant Fittler was not pressured into it.
Well, I wanted Freddie over there if I was going as a footballer. He's a great leader. But it was a tough position for Freddie, and he was at one stage he didn't want to go.
After falling off a motorbike and aggravating a wrist injury, Nathan Hindmarsh is expected to be ruled out of the tour. After days of keeping West Coast Eagles fans in suspense, former dual premiership skipper John Worsfold has signed up as coach for the next 3 seasons. Worsfold had been caught in a tug-of-war between West Coast and the Fremantle Dockers, but finally decided to return to his old club. Although the man, nicknamed Woosher, has never coached at any level, he's promised to deliver a competitive team.
There's a lot of people who talk about the capabilities of the list of players at the West Coast Eagles. I've got a lot of faith in the group of players that are there and the way they can play football.
The Dockers are now likely to choose the Hawks' current assistant coach, Chris Connolly, for their #1 job. In tennis, Leighton Hewitt is moving closer to that world #1 ranking after advancing to the 3rd round of the Stuttgart Masters. He's now extended his winning streak to 15 matches after accounting for Czech Bodan Ulirok.
Yeah, when the big points come now, I'm feeling pretty confident that I'm able to draw strength from some of my big wins over the last few weeks.
Not so lucky was Mark Philippoussis, who lost in 3 sets to Wimbledon champ Goran Ivanisevic. The shock 2nd round loser was Hewitt's rival for the #1 spot, Gustavo Kuerten. More Nightline in a moment, including finance, tomorrow's weather and an update of the latest news. To finance news now, and the Australian share market finished higher today. The All Ordinaries up more than 24 points. The rally was helped by a $1.15 rise for the National Australia Bank and continuing takeover speculation surrounding Western Mining. In Tokyo, the Nikkei was up 117 points. In London tonight, the FTSE 118 points up in morning trade. Gold is fetching $281.65 US an ounce. And in European trading tonight, the Aussie dollar buying 51.15 US cents, 56 euro cents, 62 yen and 35.42 pence. The national weather, and a trough of low pressure extends over much of the east coast. There's a cold front moving over the southeastern corner of the continent, and there's a high in the Bight with a low off Western Australia. The forecast then, a storm in Darwin, becoming fine in Brisbane, fine in Sydney, partly cloudy in Canberra, showers in Melbourne, Hobart and Adelaide. And for Perth, a fine day, but with cloud increasing. Now a recap of the latest developments in today's top stories. Prime Minister Howard has arrived in Townsville this evening. It's part of his election campaigning, but it's expected he will visit the Defence Force base there tomorrow. Earlier today, the Prime Minister escalated Australia's role in the war against terrorism, announcing more than 1,500 defence personnel will be joining the fight, and they could see action within weeks. And there are new fears of increasing violence in the Middle East after today's assassination of the Israeli tourism minister in Jerusalem. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine says it did it. And that was the day. I'm Hugh Riminton from all of us here at Nightline. Good night.